So our lecture today is going to be about abstract expressionism, and this is the last art movement we cover in the History of Modern Art class. So we need to take a look back at how we've progressed in modern art, from the birth of photography in 1839 to the troublemaker Edward Manet, and especially the Salon of 1863. And then we started going through the different art movements, such as Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, its spin-off, Futurism. We hit the First World War. We bounced back with Dada and Surrealism. And that brings us up to American Modernism. So American Modernism, I have to tell you in advance, is kind of boring. It is a beautiful art still, but you have to imagine when we study the history of modern art, for the most part, we're in Europe, we're in France, and a few other countries. But over in America, what are we producing? Works like this, that don't push any boundaries, that would not be considered avant-garde. These are works that rely on the same principles and techniques that the academic schools have been teaching for literally centuries. What we have in America is what are called regionalist painters. Grant Wood, for instance, from the Midwest. The same with Andrew Wyeth. And then up in New York and New England, we have Edward Hopper. One of Edward Hopper's works, House by the Railroad, is one of my favorites. It's that solitary house on the other side of the tracks, lacking any individuals. It's very isolated. And what's exciting about this work is that it's the basis for the Psycho House, which is one of my favorite movies. And it perfectly fits into that type of scene. We also have landscape painters, and Charles Sheeler was originally a photographer, but also did a tremendous amount of painting, showing really the production that the U.S. was in the midst of. But then we have World War II, and we also have the rise of abstract expressionism. So basically what has happened is World War II has come to an end, and it has devastated Europe. Both artists and artworks have come to America for safekeeping. In the image at the left, you see Marcel Duchamp, a famous Cubist and Dada artist. The work by Mondrian at the right would have been hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And also, Mondrian, up until 1944, would have been hanging out on the steps in front of that museum. Like you could just hang out, have a hot dog with him, and chat with him. New York becomes the center of the art world in 1945. And we have the rise of abstract expressionism. It's considered the very first American art movement, and Jackson Pollock is the leader. Now we have different names that we call this group. Most commonly, it's the abstract expressionists, but they're also called the action painters and the New York School. So what's exciting about this part of the course is that we can plot our movement from representational through abstraction, and now we get to what's called non-objective art. So representational art, this would have been like back with Impressionism, where we had everything which really kind of looked normal. And then we had abstraction with like Cubism and Futurism. And now we're into non-objective art, where we don't even have a basis for an object here. I mean, this is why it's non-objective and sometimes called non-representational art. Each of these artists that we're going to cover had their own unique style and perspective. Keep in mind that these were also all painters. There are no abstract expressionist sculptures. The canvases are not treated or primed in the traditional technique. They're very raw. There's no underdrawing either or preliminary drawing to the rendering of these paintings. A lot of times these artists say that it came from their subconscious, and it tends to be sometimes linked with surrealism for that reason. When we look at Edward Hopper's paintings, they're absolutely guided by a plan or an idea. He filled notebooks worth of plans for these paintings. And you also definitely need to know this person here, Clement Greenberg. And he comes up with the language of formalism. He is an art critic who really pushes these abstract expressionist artists to fame. He's the one that publicizes their work and lets the public know how to digest these works, because these are something that is so different than anything that had ever been seen before. So the famous art critic, teacher, and curator, Harold Rosenblum, wrote that at a certain moment, the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act, rather than as a space in which to reproduce, redesign, analyze, or express an object, actual or imagined. And so that first part of that statement, that he highlights American painters, because that's where abstract expressionism is happening. And he also says that these are arenas in which to act. So the idea of an arena being something that we can literally step into, something that takes up a lot of space, really denotes imagery, particularly of Jackson Pollock. He painted unlike any other painter ever had. He basically reimagined painting. Instead of painting on a canvas that was on a wall or on an easel, he took that canvas down and put it on the ground. And he dripped, he poured, he splattered paint. One of his nicknames was Jack the Dripper. And you can see how he's standing at the edge of his canvas, but he actually moves into it. And he does almost like a dance with the paint. The movement of his hands and his arms we call the heroic gesture. And by the way, when he was painting like this as well, most of the time he was pretty drunk. And he had jazz music cranked up. So a lot of people look at his paintings and say that this is the manifestation of jazz. He's got a great interview with William Wright, which was one of our readings for this class. And in that, he says, quote, "I wanted to express my feelings rather than to illustrate them." And when we start to look at these artists, we have to realize that they were trained professionally and academically, and their early works look totally normal. It's only their advanced works that are in this new type of style. So this is what Pollock is mostly noted for, are these drip paintings. We saw segments of him in My Kid Could Paint That, and also that last documentary about Terry Horton's painting, just focused on his style of art. And you can see that some of these are very well layered. Incredible prices for these works as well. And just to give you an idea of how large these paintings can get, it is not uncommon to find a Pollock painting 8 feet by 13 feet, which is what this one is. This is called Autumn Rhythm. Lee Krasner was Jackson Pollock's wife, and we really don't give her enough credit. This is a person who gave up her career as a painter to promote Jackson Pollock. And she knew that his works were so special, but she also knew that he couldn't do it by himself, that he had too many issues mentally, and also being an alcoholic for so long, he would never have been able to market his works or anything. So she pushed his works into galleries and such, and really stood by him throughout his entire life. Unfortunately, he did treat her pretty poorly, and she did go back to painting after his death, but never got the fame that she truly deserves. Willem de Kooning, definitely a friend of Pollock's. His works are a little bit more representational, and perhaps we could even say he was the most famous painter of the 1950s, particularly with this work at the right called Woman, which came out in 1952. The way he painted was he would apply paint and then scrape it off and then reapply it. The brush he used was about 3 feet in length, and definitely there were textural elements from the scraping in his works. A lot of people took offense at this painting. However, even his wife stood by his side, and they argued that this was just the contemporary way of representing a female figure. It's not unlike these ancient fertility sculptures back from prehistoric age, or a rising Venus during the Renaissance, or even a pinup during the wartime. And here are a few other of his works. Unfortunately, with de Kooning, he lived until the 1990s, but developed Alzheimer's. And his last works were absolutely very non-objective, and he's going to pass away in 1993 from that disease. Mark Rothko, probably second to Pollock in terms of not just importance, but popularity. His works sell for millions and millions of dollars. Mark Rothko himself was fairly well off. He was also, toward the end of his life, a college professor. He had been educated at Yale University. His works were, again, kind of emerging from surrealism. He said that these were pathways to different worlds and realities. These are considered landscape paintings, according to Rothko, and usually using a minimal amount of colors, 3 to 4 per work. When we look at his early works like this, they're very bright, very colorful, but as we progress through his time periods, particularly as we get into the late 1960s and 70s, they begin to be very dark, and he's going to end up taking his own life in 1970, cutting his wrists in his studio. He had just gotten divorced, just moved into his studio, and one of his studio assistants found him. He did receive very lucrative commissions during his life, particularly one of his paintings hangs at the Seagram Building in New York. There is a link in the description to a auction from Christie's for one of the Rothko paintings. I do want you to pause the video right here, go to the description, watch that auction. It's going to take about 7 minutes, and then we'll finish up with the rest of the artists. Alright, so let's take a look at a few more of these artists. Barnett Newman and his famous zip paintings, whereas we saw with Rothko, he believed his paintings were landscape paintings. This artist believes that his works are figural. And again, these are really large paintings. We can see Barnett Newman standing in front of this work here. He was also a very moody artist. He got a bad review in the 1950s and ended up going back to his studio and destroying a number of his works. He was also a very good sculptor. This work is one of 3 he did to commemorate or memorialize Martin Luther King Jr. Ad Reinhardt, again focused in New York. His work there at the right and here kind of remind me of tile flooring designs that we see in some of the buildings around campus. But his famous work is this one here. And I know it just looks like a painting that is completely black, but when you start to stare at it, some different things happen. It's basically different shades of black together in kind of a tic-tac-toe board. And the idea here is that not only are we thinking about why he's painting this, so we have mental changes in our thinking, but we also have biological changes with our pupils dilating and such. So it is a really kind of interesting work. Of course, this person had to check on his phone what he was looking at. Few people enjoying it. Me questioning it. And Adolf Gottlieb, I throw this image in. He is an abstract expressionist as well, but again, to give you an idea of the size of these paintings, that these were being worked on as they were on the ground, and the different types of tools that these artists had to use. Definitely unconventional compared to the regular artist. Helen Frankenthaler is the last of the abstract expressionists to pass away. She died in 2011, and up until pretty much her last days, she was lecturing on college campuses. She paints very similar in a way to Pollock. However, she mixes her paint with paint thinner. So it's much more liquid and is absorbed by the canvas. So it actually stains it. And there is also some like osmosis work as it transmutes through the different threads. So there is some of this painting that is left up to chance. But these are called stain paintings. And sometimes she does do some drawing as well. Some charcoal is used on this work here. And then what's unique is that her titles of these works are very representational. However, the paintings are non-representational. They're non-objective. What she would do is she would finish a number of these paintings, like 12 to 20, and then she would call up Clement Greenberg. And without even seeing the paintings, he would rattle off titles to her, and that's how these paintings were named. Morris Louis is a little bit different in terms of abstract expressionists because he did not live in New York. He lived down in Washington, D.C., and so he wasn't as closely tied into this group. But you can kind of see that he's letting gravity do his own work here. He's not even using a paintbrush. This is also a completely staged photograph for a magazine. Nobody ever saw this person paint, not even his wife. He had a studio out in the backyard, and many times the studio was roughly the size of the canvas he was working on. This canvas that you see in this image here has stretcher bars, which is why you have that very rectangular shape. But what he would do a lot of times is he would just take raw canvas without the wood bars along the back, and he would tie sticks to the edges, and he would pour paint on top of the canvas, and so he would manipulate the canvas very much like a puppeteer would manipulate a puppet or a marionette. This is one of my favorite works that he does, and in order to create this, what he did is he took the canvas, rolled it up like a funnel, and then poured paint in at various levels as in that cone-shaped funnel. And then when he opened it up, this is the image that was created. This one done in a very similar fashion. And once again, these are very large images, so this gives you an idea of what these artists were actually creating. And so here, this is where I'm going to end my lecture on abstract expressionism.